Madam President,
The senator controls 20 minutes.
Thank you. Madam President, let me begin by thanking my colleague from Louisiana, Senator Vitter, not only for his remarks today, but for his excellent work throughout this process. And I've enjoyed working with him. And one of the things that I think we have tried to do in this whole process is bring together people who come from very different ideologies to basically make the point that the time is now that we have got to end secrecy at the Fed. Madam President, I should also say, Madam President, I would like to yield myself 15 minutes. If you can let me know when 15 minutes has expired.
The
Madam
senator
President,
will be notified.
At a time when the Federal Reserve has provided the largest taxpayer bailout in the history of the world to the largest financial institutions in this country, trillion-dollar institutions, without the approval of Congress, without the real knowledge of the American people, this amendment makes it clear, the Sanders Amendment makes it clear, that the Fed can no longer operate in the kind of secrecy that it has operated in forever. Under the Sanders Amendment, for the first time, the American people will know exactly who received over $2 trillion in zero or virtually zero interest loans from the Fed, and they will know the exact terms of those financial arrangements. Under this amendment, under the Sanders Amendment, for the first time, the GAO will be required to conduct a top-to-bottom comprehensive audit of every single emergency action that the Fed has undertaken since the financial crisis began. Under the Sanders Amendment, for the first time, the GAO will investigate whether there were conflicts of interest surrounding the emergency actions of the Fed. Madam President, the Fed has been fighting all the way to the United States Supreme Court to keep this information secret. Well, Madam President, this amendment says in no uncertain terms that this money does not belong to the Fed, it belongs to the American people, and the American people have a right to know where their taxpayer dollars are going. That is not a difficult concept to get one's hands around. The American people have a right to know. Specifically, the Sanders Amendment does two things. First, it requires the Fed to put on its website by December 1st, 2010, the names of all of the financial institutions, corporations, and foreign central banks. Let me repeat, foreign central banks that receive trillions of dollars in taxpayer assistance from the Fed since the beginning of the financial bailout period. Second, the Sanders Amendment requires the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, to conduct a top-to-bottom comprehensive audit of all of the emergency actions the Fed has taken since the beginning of the financial crisis, with a particular focus on all of the potential conflicts of interest within these secret deals. And that, Madam President, is an extremely important point, which, by the way, was not in my original amendment. Madam President, the fight for a GAO audit of the Fed and to require more transparency has been a long and arduous struggle. There are many people to thank for being at the point we are today. Partisan politics aside, this has been a joint effort on the part of some of the most progressive members of Congress and some of the most conservative, some of the most progressive grassroots organizations in this country, and some of the most conservatives. I specifically want to thank, here in the Senate, Majority Leader Reid, Majority Whip Durbin, Senators Dorgan, Feingold, Boxer, and Leahy, and many others for their leadership on this issue on my side of the aisle, and to thank Senators DeMint, Vitter, Brownback, McCain, and others, Grassley and others on the other side of the aisle. Now, last week, Madam President, a number of senators, Democrats and Republicans, indicated to me that they were uncomfortable with my original amendment, which they believed would have allowed Congress to be involved in the day-to-day monetary operations of the Fed. That was never my intention, and I still do not believe that that original amendment would have done that. But nonetheless, that is what a number of senators believed and were concerned about and came to me about. Chairman of the Banking Committee, Senator Dodd, indicated to me that if we could clarify this issue, he would not only be supportive of this amendment, but he would co-sponsor it, and that's exactly what he did, and I very much appreciate his support. Let me just very briefly speak to what the principles of this amendment are. Number one, the Sanders Amendment, in terms of transparency, it is clear that we need to make sure that the Federal Reserve releases the names of every single financial institution, corporation, and foreign central bank that the Fed provided over $2 trillion in taxpayer assistance to since the financial crisis started, and what the exact details of those arrangements were. This information, as a result of this amendment, will be on the Fed on December 1st, 2010, and every single American who has a computer will be able to access that information. That is a major, major step forward. Secondly, in terms of the audit, I have always believed that the main purpose of this audit was for the GAO to conduct a top-to-bottom comprehensive review of every single emergency action the Fed has undertaken since the start of the financial crisis, and that is exactly what this amendment does. In addition, Madam President, let me be clear. The modified amendment, the amendment that I am offering today, is stronger than my original amendment in one very important point, a point that I think millions of Americans are concerned about. And that is the Sanders Amendment of today requires the GAO to investigate whether there were conflicts of interest in the establishment of the emergency lending programs at the Fed. My original amendment would have allowed the GAO to look into conflicts of interest at the Fed, but did not require it. This amendment requires it. We're very specific about that. For example, Madam President, I want to know, and I think the American people want to know, why Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, attended a meeting at the New York Fed when the federal government decided to bail out AIG to the eventual tune of $182 billion, allowing Goldman Sachs to pocket $13 billion of that money. My original amendment would have allowed the GAO to look at this. This new amendment makes it clear that this kind of conflict of interest must be looked into by the GAO. Further, I want to know, and I think the American people want to know, why the head of the New York Fed, Stephen Friedman, was allowed to serve on the board of directors at Goldman Sachs and was allowed to purchase over 37,000 shares of Goldman stock at the same time that the New York Fed was approving Goldman's application to become a bank holding company. My original amendment would have allowed the GAO to look into this. The new Sanders Amendment requires the Fed to investigate whether conflicts of interest existed in these types of financial deals. Madam President, some 35 members of the Fed's Board of Directors are executives at banks which received over $120 billion in TARP money. I want to know, and I think the American people want to know, how much these financial institutions receive from the Fed and if this represents a conflict of interest. My original amendment would have allowed the GAO to look at this. The new Sanders Amendment requires the GAO to take a look at those potential conflicts of interest. Madam President, what is important to point out is that in terms of transparency, I am not the only person. Other members of the Senate are not the only people who are demanding that the Fed tell us whom they lent money to. I would point out that Bloomberg News has gone to court and has in fact won 2 federal court decisions against the Fed, in which courts have said that the Feds have got to release that information, but the Fed persists in saying no, they want to keep that information secret. So that is where we are today, Madam President. We are on the verge of lifting the veil of secrecy at perhaps the most important government agency in the United States of America, an agency which has control and expends trillions of dollars. They do it behind closed doors. They do it in ways that the American people know very little about. So I would ask for strong support for the Sanders Amendment so that we can go forward and break this veil of secrecy. And with that, Madam President, I would reserve the balance of my time.